Welcome. This is the e-learning course on the Nibbāna sermons 1 to 11 by Venerable Kathakuru Ñāṇananda, and course hosted by the Numata Center for Buddhist Studies at the University of Hamburg in collaboration with the Paris Center for Buddhist Studies in Massachusetts. And today we are going to look at sermon number 6. But before that, there's still a number of things from the discussion related to the last sermon. First is on the Samudaya Sutta. There's a comment by Robert Grosh. He said, I was astonished to find Mano-Sañcetana volition as a nutriment of the body. And Simon Adam Leonard said, contemplating the dependence of the body on nutriment, especially the aspect that the body stops functioning without the intake of food, water, and air, and really letting it sink in, gives me a sense of the danger and disadvantage connected with the body. But I still have some difficulty to see the nutriment factors of contact and mental volition in regard to the body. Yeah, I also reflected on that, and I found for myself the idea of relating the Kayanupassana Satipatthana, the first Satipatthana of contemplation of the body, to all four nutriments does not really strike me so much as clear. The whole point, the way I understand Satipatthana, is really to have this four different but complementary domains of practice. And for body contemplation, for each of the others, we even get this repetition, Kaye Kayanupassi Viharati, to dwell contemplating the body in the body. And so I don't really see how this could then be related to seeing volition or consciousness as other nutriments. And I agree with Simon very much that if we expand beyond Kapalinkara Ahara, beyond food, then this would be much more fittingly done along the lines of the four elements. And so I just wanted to go through the Samudaya Sutta again briefly, because I think it's just quite fascinating and interesting, the perspective that comes out of the practice. And this perspective I'm presenting is based on the comparison of the Satipatthana Sutta with its two canonical parallels, which I've discussed in my perspectives on Satipatthana, and focusing only on those exercises which are common to the parallel versions. So in the case of contemplation of the body, and this is then just the anatomical parts, the elements, and the cemetery contemplations. And contemplation of Dharma is just the hindrances and the awakening factors. In fact, the hindrances are not fully found even in all three versions, but I have argued in my book why I think they should be included. So then if we look at contemplation of the body, as Leonard pointed out, the factor of nutriment becomes very obvious with the elements. This is the way I understand what Leonard was saying. And when we do element contemplation, there's this internal elements, and then there are the external elements. And contemplating that, one realizes the not-self nature and the lack of sufficient grounding for making it a real difference between elements within and elements without. And from that, naturally, there comes this insight into the degree to which this body here is totally dependent on supply of the elements from the outside, and this is precisely nutriment. Earth element in the form of food, water element in the form of beverages, and then fire element in the form of needing to protect this body so that it is at the very small temperature range within which it can actually function. Say here in the West, when we are in the winter, then we need heating and warm clothing. And air is wind, the wind element. The constant supply of oxygen is perhaps the one, if we can call it a nutriment, It's the one nutriment that is most direly needed. And when the body does not get these nutriments, then what happens is it will die. And that naturally leads over to the contemplation of the corpse, the body in stages of decay. So to look at the body from the viewpoint of its dependency on nutriment in this wider sense does indeed bring out very clearly the inherent disadvantage of having a body. And then contemplation of feeling, contact. Contact is where feeling arises. And the thing with feeling is it is conditioned and conditioning. It is conditioned by the type of contact from which it arises, and it conditions the reactions that happen to feeling, in particular craving, if we look at it from the viewpoint of paticca samuppada. And that is also in my way of practicing satipatthana what comes out so strongly with the second satipatthana, the contemplation of feeling, the conditionality, the direct experience of paticca samuppada at that crucial link between feeling and craving. Then name and form, I already said during the last lecture that to me what stands out here particularly would be volition, cetana, as that factor within name that in that five finger simile, that the finger that sticks out most from the five fingers, that this decisive input by volition supported by the other factors of name, and of course the experience of matter. And then contemplation of dharmas, manasikara, attention, in this simplified version of satipatthana that emerges from comparative study. We just have the hindrances and the awakening factors. And the hindrances, no, let me step back one more time. Attention is of course part of name and thus present in every state of mind. So the question is not so much do we pay attention or not, but how we pay attention. And this is precisely an issue that underlies the hindrances and the awakening factors. The hindrances arise because of ayoniso manasikara, unwise or not radical, not penetrative, superficial attention. And we get out of them by yoniso manasikara, wise, penetrative, radical attention. And with the awakening factors, it's the opposite. Due to yoniso manasikara, they arise, and due to ayoniso manasikara, we are lost. They are lost. So the gist of contemplation of dharmas can then really be seen as being intimately related to the arising of attention in its yoniso and ayoniso manifestations. And by developing this perspective, the Samudaya Sutta gives something very practical, very easily applicable to give us a basic flavor of each of the satipatthanas. The body's dependency on nutriment. Feeling, the conditionality of feeling. Mind, what direction do volitions go? And Dharma, what is the contemplation of Dharma? Progress on the path to awakening by emerging out of unwise attention and cultivating wise attention. That was the first point I wanted to make. Then there were a lot of beautiful comments on the imagery, in particular of the cinema and the whirlpool. And I just wanted to share this because I thought they were all very, very stimulating. So Fred Martinson, the comparisons with the cinema, theater and pictures and how we direct that Charna movie is one of the best examples of our delusion that I have heard. Yes, indeed. Margaret Roman, when we let go within the samsaric whirlpool and come out at the bottom of it, we realize the stories we created were projections onto the movie screen of our minds and hearts. Katrina Bergbauer, quite simply, I've come to know better the unreliability of my own mind and thought process, and I'm intuiting that orientation is of potential benefit for the understanding of Nibbāna. Hugh Chow. The understanding of the dependent and tangled relation between name and form, as well as between name and form and consciousness, has been an indispensable guidance for my practice, because it guards me against dogmatically holding two different experiences. As I understand further the dependent nature of meditative perceptions in regard to the procedures of conditioning in different meditation approaches, my tendency to overly promote certain meditation approaches over others indeed weakens. I come to realize the beauty, internal coherency, appropriateness of different meditative approaches and keep myself focusing on the goal of non-clinging. Matt Weingast. The light of wisdom, therefore, is not just about seeing that one's life story is just a story. It also shows that it is not the only story. Instead, there are a whole world of stories out there and people living in them. After seeing this, one can never return to the same level of self-absorption. Letizia Baglioni. The perceptual and emotional freedom born of disenchantment and seeing through the magic show seems to allow for a dislocation from the grasped cluster of experience we call self, resulting in a greater understanding of diversity and a sensitivity for what each situation or story requires. Glimpses of this fuel my motivation to practice. Yeah, I just have, I can only applaud all of these comments. I just wanted to share them. Then there's a comment by Alexei Novak. It seems to me that the Venerable is helpfully interested in themes often associated with Mahayana teachings, such as non-duality. The riddle quotes from the sermon are somewhat reminiscent of the perfection of wisdom literature. Caught up in the movie, we mistakenly separate out a story of the world and a story of me that can then relate to each other. In fact, consciousness is both the movie and the viewer. This train of thought makes me worry about solipsism. And Robert Grosch, in reply, he says he thinks that the simile of the movie should not be taken too far. Of course, we only experience the world with our mind. But that does not mean that the mind is all there is. It does not mean that the world does not exist. Of course, the world outside also exists. I see the main intention of the simile to show that our experience is much more fabricated by our own mind than we usually are aware of. And I wanted to take up on that point again because I think it is something very important to keep in mind, and I particularly like to look at it also from the perspective of the development of the Mahayana traditions. And so if I'm allowed to try to present in a very simple, hopefully not simplistic manner, rather complex historical process in the Buddhist traditions, I would present it as this, in this way perhaps, that we could imagine that after the Buddha's death, the teacher no longer being there, there was a very strong concern for the teachings to be preserved, so that the path to awakening is still available. And this concern, because of the analytical approach of the Buddha, naturally then went into not only the general thrust of the teachings, but also the details. And so we can see how gradually things becoming ever more detailed. And these details somehow become also more fixed. And as this becomes more detailed and more fixed, there is perhaps quite understandably and naturally an emphasis on is and is not as the two extremes that, according to the Kaccayanagotta Sutta, should be avoided in order to navigate the middle path of dependent arising. And so eventually out of this exegetical activity, we get understandable tendency towards reification of these details, and loss of the middle path position towards is, affirming things as they are. And naturally also this then leads to response. And this is also where we can, for example, in fact, Nagarjuna quotes the Kaccayana Sutta. So the attempt then to come out of is and return to the middle path position obviously has to then say it is not. But as then we keep saying it is not, then there is a danger of going to the other extreme of there is nothing. And this is, in fact, we can see that in the history of Buddhist thought, how this navigating from one extreme to the other then leads into the other direction. And concepts, simply tools that have a use, become first invested with a deeper significance. They actually refer to something real. And in order to undermine that tendency, in the end, they are so much demolished, excuse me, that the concepts are being chucked out. And both are extremes. And the first one, the is, stands the danger of losing sight of the phenomenological perspective of early Buddhism, of the conditional impact of perception on what is perceived. But the is not goes to the other extreme and falls prey to monocausality, as if perception were the only cause of what we perceive. And I think for approaching even these Nibbāna sermons or the practice, it is helpful to see these two extremes, is and is not, and always come back to this middle path of dependent arising. In the words of Robert, simply to see that our experience is more fabricated by our own mind than we are usually aware of, but not to see it as entirely a mental fabrication. And then there's a last comment by Yin Cheng. And she comments on the Chinese term used to translate sankhara. So the literal meaning of Xing, it struck me that this single character captured a key aspect conveyed by sankhara, something that is not still. The etymology of Xing is like a man walking with his left and right feet. And I have it here. So that is one of the, there are actually two etymologies, is that the correct word? Two ways of deriving the Chinese character for sankharas. One is the one that I'm showing here, which is like the 2 feet. Another one is also the idea of a crossroad. And I find both very, very helpful, and I'm grateful that she brought up this, because sankhara is in fact a central theme in this 6th sermon. And so if we look at it from the viewpoint of a crossroad, the alternative explanation, it is really this, the karmic dimension, the decision we take which road to go, the road that leads out of dukkha or the road that leads deeper into dukkha. But if we take the more commonly recognized derivation of the 2 feet, and what she says, it really brings out this activity, something that is never still. And I thought that is very powerful to relate that to the images of the movie and the whirlpool. The movie takes its attraction from the action, and the more action, sankhara, is there in the movie film, the more we will be following it with a lot of attention. But to my personal mind, even more powerful is the whirlpool imagery, the reciprocal conditioning between consciousness and name and form, forming this whirlpool. I'm just thinking of the drawing Robert made that I showed in the 4th sermon, where he had this kind of whirling thing around between these 2 links, independent arising, and the suction that pulls us into that whirlpool, that would be sankhara then. That activity, that pulling in. And the more it pulls in, the more solid, the more real this whirlpool becomes. So thanks to all of you for all these comments, and now ready to go into the actual sermon number 6. Etang santang etang panitang yadidang sabba sankhara samato sab upari padinissaggo tanhatkayo virago nirodho Nibbānam. This is peaceful, this is excellent, namely the stilling of all preparations, the relinquishment of all assets, the destruction of craving, detachment, cessation, extinction. With the permission of the most venerable great preceptor and the assembly of the venerable meditative monks. In our last sermon, we happened to discuss how the concept of existence, built up with the help of ignorance and influxes, comes to cease with the cessation of ignorance and influxes. We explained it by means of similes and illustrations based on the film show and the drama. As the starting point, we took up the simile of the picture called Charana, which the Buddha had made use of in the Gadmula Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya. With reference to a picture called Charana, popular in contemporary India, the Buddha has declared that the mind is more picturesque than that Charana picture. As an adaptation of that Charana picture for the modern day, we referred to the movie film and the drama in connection with our discussion of sankharas in particular and paticcasamuppada in general. Today, let us try to move a little forward in the same direction. In the latter part of the same second Gadmula Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya, Khanda Samyutta, the Buddha gives a simile of a painter. Translated, it would read as follows. Just as a dyer or a painter would fashion the likeness of a woman or of a man, complete in all its major and minor parts, on a well-planed board or a wall or on a strip of cloth, with dye or lac or turmeric or indigo or madder. Even so, the untaught worldling creates as it were his own form, feelings, perceptions, preparations, and consciousness. What the Buddha wants to convey to us by this comparison of the 5 grasping groups to an artifact done by a painter is the insubstantiality and the vanity of those 5 groups. It brings out their compound and made-up nature. This essencelessness and emptiness is more clearly expressed in the Pena Pindupama Sutta of the Khanda Samyutta. The summary verse at the end of that discourse would suffice for the present. Pena Pindupamang Rupang Vedana Bubbulupama Marichi Kupama Sanya Sankhara Kadalupama Mayupamancha Viññāṇaṃ Dīpidādicca Bandhana. Comment, translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. Form is like a lump of foam, feeling like a water bubble. Perception is like a mirage, volitions like a plantain trunk, and consciousness like an illusion. So explained the kinsman of the sun. End of comment. It says that the Buddha, the kinsman of the sun, has compared form to a mass of foam, feeling to a water bubble, perception to a mirage, preparations to a banana trunk, and consciousness to a magic show. These 5 similes bring out the insubstantiality of the 5 grasping groups. Their simulating and deceptive nature is indicated by the similes. Not only the magic show, but even the other similes, like the mass of foam, are suggestive of simulation, in giving a false notion of compactness. They all convey the idea of insubstantiality and deceptiveness. Consciousness in particular is described in that context as a conjurer's trick. In the course of our discussion, we happen to touch upon the significance of sankharas or preparations. As far as their relevance to films and dramas is concerned, they impart an appearance of reality to parts and acts which make up a film or a drama. Realism, in the context of art and drama, amounts to an apparent reality. It connotes the skill in deceiving the audience. It is in fact only a show of reality. The successful drama is one that effectively hoodwinks an audience. So realism in that context means appearing as real. It therefore has a nuance of deception. Now, what supports this deceptive and delusive quality of preparations is ignorance. All this acting that is going on in the world is kept up by ignorance, which provides the background for it. Just as in a drama, such preparations as change of dress, makeup contrivances, character portrayal, and stagecraft create an atmosphere of delusion, so also are the sankharas or preparations, instrumental in building up these 5 grasping groups. So all this goes to show that the term sankhara has the sense of preparing or producing. The realistic appearance of a film or a drama is capable of creating a delusion in an audience. Similarly, the apparent reality of the animate and inanimate objects in the world creates delusion in the worldlings. Now, to hark back to 2 lines of a verse we had quoted earlier, Moha sambandhano lukho bhabbarupova dissati. The world appears as real to one who is fettered to delusion. This means that the world has an apparent reality, that it merely gives the impression of something real to one who is deluded. It is clear, therefore, that sankharas are responsible for some sort of preparation or concoction. What serves as the background for it is the darkness of ignorance. This preparation, this concoction goes on behind the veil of ignorance. We come across a discourse in the Samyutta Nikaya in which this primary sense of preparation in the word sankhara is explicitly stated, namely the Kanjaniya Sutta. In that discourse, each of the 5 grasping groups is defined, and the term sankhara is defined as follows. Kincha bhikkhave sankhare vaditha sankhatang abhisankaronti iti ko bhikkhave tasma sankharati mujjanti. Kincha sankhatang abhisankaronti rupang rupattaya sankhatang abhisankaronti vedanang vedanattaya sankhatang abhisankaronti sanyang sanyattaya sankhatang abhisankaronti sankhare sankharattaya sankhatang abhisankaronti Viññāṇaṁ viññānattaya sankhatang abhisankaronti. Sankhatang abhisankaronti iti ko bhikkhave tasma sankharati mujjanti. And what, monks, would you say are preparations? They prepare the prepared. That, monks, is why they are called preparations. And what is the prepared that they prepare? They prepare as a prepared form into the state of form. They prepare as a prepared feeling into the state of feeling. They prepare as a prepared perception into the state of perception. They prepare as a prepared preparations into the state of preparations. They prepare as a prepared consciousness into the state of consciousness. They prepare the prepared, so that is why, monks, they are called preparations. Comment, translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. And why, bhikkhus, do you call them volitional formations? They construct the condition, bhikkhus. Therefore, they are called volitional formations. And what is the condition that they construct? They construct conditioned form as form. They construct conditioned feeling as feeling. They construct conditioned perception as perception. They construct conditioned volitional formations as volitional formations. They construct conditioned consciousness as consciousness. They construct the conditioned because, therefore, they are called volitional formations. And here's my translation of the Chinese parallel. What has the characteristic of being constructed is the formation's aggregate of clinging. What is being constructed? Bodily form is being constructed. Feeling, perception, formations, consciousness is being constructed. Because it has the characteristic of being constructed, it is called the formation's aggregate of clinging. Again, this formation's aggregate of clinging is impermanent, dukkha, and of a nature to change. The last sentence does not have a counterpart in the Pali, but it really brings out the whole point of it nicely sums up the point of the presentation. End of comment. This explains why sankharas are so called. That is to say, the sense in which they are called sankharas. They prepare the prepared, sankata, into that state. And the prepared is form, feeling, perception, preparations, and consciousness. Sankharas are therefore instrumental in building up each of these grasping groups. The most intriguing statement is that even the sankharas are built up by sankharas. They play the part of preparing a sort of make-believe activity. In this sense, it is associated with the idea of intention, as being produced by intention. The two terms abhisankatam, abhisanchitaitam are often found in juxtaposition, as if they are synonymous. Abhisankata means specially prepared, and abhisanchitaitam means thought out or intended. Here we see the relationship of sankharas to intention. The preparation is done by means of intentions. The two words ceteti, pakappeti are also found used together. Intention and imagination play their part in this matter of preparation. So in the last analysis, it is something constructed by imagination. All of these 5 groups are thought constructs. As suggested by the similes of the picture and the painter, these 5 groups in the final reckoning turn out to be the products of imagination. Comment. Yeah, I think the last statement, I personally don't think it should be taken too literal. I think it's just a way of bringing out the deluding nature of the aggregates, and I do not think that the Venerable is intending to go to make the point that the 5 aggregates do not exist at all and are just the product of imagination. And this comment I'm making here relates to what I said at the outset of the lecture about the need to clearly navigate between the 2 extremes. So the Charna picture and the other similes, as Robert, I think, said so clearly, they are meant to show us that we are fabricating much more than we are aware of. But the point is not to end up with solipsism, to pretend that everything is entirely a product of imagination. End of comment. As far as the nature of these preparations is concerned, there are these 3 kinds of preparations mentioned in the Dhamma, namely Kaya Sankhara, Vaci Sankhara, and Mano Sankhara. Bodily preparations, verbal preparations, and mental preparations. These terms have to do with merit and demerit. They are cited in connection with karma, implying that beings accumulate karma by means of body, word, and mind. What supports this heaping up of preparations is ignorance. Ignorance provides the background, as in the case of the drama and the movie. This relationship between ignorance and preparations is clearly brought out in the Cetana Sutta of the Sanchitaniya Vagga of the Anguttara Nikaya. According to that sutta, the world attributes an activity to something by regarding it as a unit, by perceiving it as a compact unit. In other words, it is the way of the world to superimpose the concept of a unit or self-agency to wherever there appears to be some sort of activity. As we mentioned in connection with the simile of the whirlpool, viewed from a distance, the whirlpool appears as a center or a base. In the same way, wherever there appears to be some form of activity, we tend to bring in the concept of a unit. Now it is this very ignorance, this ignoring, that becomes the seedbed for preparations. The basic presumption of this ignorance is that preparations must originate from a unitary center. And the Buddha also points out in the Cittana Sutta of the Sanchitaniya Vagga that the root cause of bodily, verbal, and mental preparations is ignorance. Since the discourse is rather lengthy, we propose to analyze it in 3 sections for facility of understanding. Kayeva bhikkhave sati kaya sancetana hetu upapajjati ajhattam sukha dukkham. Vachayava bhikkhave sati vaci sancetana hetu upapajjati ajhattam sukha dukkham. Maniva bhikkhave sati Mano sancetana hetu uppajjati ajhattam sukha-dukkhaṃ avijja paccayāva. Monks, when the body is there, due to bodily intention, there arises inward pleasure and pain. Monks, when speech is there, due to verbal intention, there arises inward pleasure and pain. Monks, when mind is there, due to mental intention, there arises inward pleasure and pain, all conditioned by ignorance. Comment, translation by Bhikkhu. Because when there's the body, then because of bodily volition, pleasure and pain arise internally. When there is speech, then because of verbal volition, pleasure and pain arise internally. When there's the mind, then because of mental volition, pleasure and pain arise internally, with ignorance itself as condition. End of comment. Now let us take this as the first section and try to get at its meaning. Given the concept of a body, due to intentions based on that concept of a body, there arises inwardly pleasure and pain. That is, when one imagines that there's a body, due to thoughts which take body as the object, one experiences pleasure and pain. What is called the body is a huge mass of activity, something like a big workshop or a factory. But because of ignorance, if one takes it as one thing, that is, as a unit, then there's room for bodily intentions to come in. One can objectify the body and arouse thoughts of the body. Thereby one experiences pleasure and pain. This is the implication of the above statement. Similarly, in the case of speech, it may be said that language is a conglomeration of letters and words. But when speech is taken as a real unit, one can form intentions about speech and inwardly experience pleasure and pain. So also in the case of the mind. It is not an entity by itself, like a soul, as postulated by other religions. It is again only a heap of thoughts. But if one grants that there is a mind, due to that very presumption, one experiences inwardly pleasure and pain with mind as its object. The concluding phrase of that paragraph is particularly significant. It says that all this is conditioned by ignorance. Let us now take up the second part. Samang vatang bhikkave kaya sankharang abhisankaroti yang paccayasatang uppajjati ajhattam sukha dukkham. Parevasatang bhikkave kaya sankharang abhisankaronti yang paccayasatang uppajjati ajhattam sukha dukkham. Sampajanavatang bhikkave kaya sankharang abhisankaroti yang paccayasatang uppajjati ajhattam sukha dukkham. Asampajanavatang bhikkave kaya sankharang abhisankaroti yang paccayasatang uppajjati ajhattam sukha dukkham. Either he himself prepares that bodily preparation, owing to which there would be that inward pleasure and pain, or else others prepare for him that bodily preparation, owing to which there would be for him inward pleasure and pain. Either he, being fully aware, prepares that bodily preparation, owing to which there would be for him inward pleasure and pain, or else he, being fully unaware, prepares that bodily preparation, owing to which there would be for him that inward pleasure and pain. Comment, translation by Bhikkhu. Either on one's own because one performs that bodily volitional activity, conditioned by which pleasure and pain arise in one internally, or others make one generate that bodily volitional activity, conditioned by which pleasure and pain arise in one internally. Either with clear comprehension, one performs that bodily volitional activity, conditioned by which pleasure and pain arise in one internally, or without clear comprehension, one performs that bodily volitional activity, conditioned by which pleasure and pain arise in one internally. End of comment. The substance of this paragraph seems to be that one by oneself prepares the bodily preparations that bring one pleasure or pain inwardly, and that others also prepare for him such bodily preparation. It is also said that the bodily preparation can occur either with or without awareness. About the verbal and mental preparations too, a similar specification is made. This is the summary of the second section. The third and final section is the most significant. Imesu bhikkhave dhammesu avidya anupatita. Avidyaya tveva asesa viraga nirodha sukhayo nahoti yang pacchaya satang upabhajati ajhatang sukha dukkham. Savacha nahoti yang pacchaya satang upabhajati ajhatang sukha dukkham. Sumano nahoti yang pacchaya satang upabhajati ajhatang sukha dukkham. Kettang tang nahoti, bhattung tang nahoti, ayatanam tang nahoti, adhikaranam tang nahoti, yang pacchayasatang uppanjati ajhatang sukha dukkam. Monks, in all these cases ignorance hangs on. But with the remainderless fading away and cessation of ignorance, that body is not there, owing to which there arise for him inward pleasure and pain. That speech is not there, owing to which there can arise for him inward pleasure and pain. That mind is not there, owing to which there can arise for him inward pleasure and pain. That field is not there, that sight is not there, that base is not there, that reason is not there, owing to which there can arise for him inward pleasure and pain. Common translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. Ignorance is comprised within these states, but with the remainderless fading away and cessation of ignorance, that body does not exist, conditioned by which that pleasure and pain arise in one internally. That speech does not exist, conditioned by which that pleasure and pain arise in one internally. That mind does not exist, conditioned by which that pleasure and pain arise in one internally. That field does not exist, that sight does not exist, that base does not exist, that location does not exist, conditioned by which that pleasure and pain arise in one internally. End of comment. Since all the instances mentioned earlier are accompanied by ignorance, the utter fading away and cessation of that very ignorance prevents, as it were, the crystallization of that body, speech and mind, due to which inward pleasure and pain can arise. In other words, it removes the field, the ground, the base and the provenance for the arising of inward pleasure and pain. This shows that once the existence of a body is granted, with that concept of a body as its object, bodily preparations come to be built up. Or, in other words, given the concept of a body and due to bodily intention, that is, by treating it as a real unit, one experiences inwardly pleasure and pain because of thoughts concerning the body. So also in regard to speech and mind. It is emphatically stated that all this occurs because of ignorance. What confers on them all the status of a unit through the perception of the compact is this very ignorance. As for the second paragraph, what it says is simply that those bodily preparations and the like can be made by oneself as well as by others, and that too either being aware or unaware. Now all these are related to ignorance. Therefore, at whatever point of time this ignorance ceases completely in someone, then for him there is no consciousness of a body, though from an outside point of view he appears to have a body. He may use words, he may speak, but for him there is nothing substantial in linguistic usage. He seems to be making use of a mind. Mind objects also come up, but he does not regard it as a unit. Therefore, inwardly, no pleasures and pains come up. With the cessation of ignorance comes the cessation of preparations. Thereby all pleasures and pains cease. This, in other words, is the state of Nibbāna. It appears then that this discourse gives us a clue to the state of Nibbāna. It says something about bodily, verbal, and mental preparations. If we try to understand its message in relation to the analogy of the film show and the drama mentioned earlier, we may offer the following explanation. Now, in the case of a film show or a drama, the preparations remain as preparations so long as there is that darkness of ignorance. The realism or the realistic appearance of the acting of actors and actresses, or the roles and guises they assume in dress and speech, depends on the veil of ignorance that conceals their true nature. Similarly, here too, the implication is that it is ignorance which invests these preparations with the realistic appearance. If at any point of time that ignorance happens to cease, then there will be no pleasure or displeasure for the audience, however much make-up and pretension there is. It is such a situation of non-enjoyment that we happened to mention in the previous sermon with reference to the witnessing of a hilltop festival by Upatissa and Kolita. They had a flash of insight due to the light of wisdom that came from within, not due to any illumination from outside. Because of it, those preparations ceased to be preparations. From this we can understand that the term sankhara becomes meaningful only against the background of ignorance. To move a step further, it is against the background of both ignorance and preparations that all the subsequent links in the formula become meaningful. As far as the interrelation between consciousness and name and form is concerned, all what we have said above regarding the reflection of name and form in consciousness becomes meaningful only so long as the reality of preparations is granted, that is, only so far as their deceptive nature is maintained. But that deceptive nature owes its existence to ignorance. This way we can unravel one aspect of the essential significance of the term sankhara. Then there is another point worth considering in this respect. Sankhara as the second link in the Paticca-samuppada formula is defined by the Buddha in the Vibhanga Sutta in the Nibbāna Samyutta, not in terms of Kaya Sankhara, Vaci Sankhara and Mano Sankhara, but as Kaya Sankharo, Vaci Sankharo and Citta Sankhara. This might seem rather intriguing. Katamecha bhikkhave sankhara, tayame bhikkhave sankhara, Kaya Sankharo, Vaci Sankharo, Citta Sankhara. What monks are preparations? Monks, they are these three preparations: body preparation, speech preparation, mind preparation. Comment. I have taken a look at the parallels, and so here are first the Chinese parallels from Samyukta Agama, from an individual translation from the Ekotrika Agama, and also a Tibetan parallel from Shamatadeva. And the Chinese character and the Tibetan term that I have put in bold are those that correspond to what in Pali is the Citta Sankhara. And the rendering used in Chinese and Tibetan is the usual rendering of manas, not of Citta. And now the Chinese and Tibetan translation here are strongly suggestive of an original reading Mano Sankhara here, but we cannot be entirely sure because I have seen these renderings also used for Citta Sankhara. And even though the first term is clearly a rendering of manas, I assume that this could even be due to the fact that the translator were not necessarily aware of the rather subtle distinction between Mano Sankhara and Citta Sankhara, and so they may have just standardized translation terminology. But fortunately, we also have a Sanskrit parallel. And here is the Sanskrit: Traya Sanskara, Kaya Sanskara, Vak Sanskara, Mana Sanskara. Having that Sanskrit parallel now makes it possible for us to definitely conclude that all of these parallels differ from the Vibhanga Sutta. They differ from the Vibhanga Sutta in as much as instead of speaking of the Citta Sankhara, they speak of the Mano Sankhara. And this is of significance, and I will come back to it soon again in this talk. And I just wanted to mention that I will also be the central theme we're exploring here is Sankharas, and I'll be sharing an entry I wrote for the Encyclopedia of Buddhism on this topic on the forum, because I think it helps to give a background to the different nuances and dimensions of Sankhara. End of comment. It is noteworthy that here the term is given in the singular. In the majority of instances, it is found in the plural number. But here in the definition of the term, the singular is used as Kaya Sankharo, Vaci Sankharo, and Citta Sankharo. The significance of this usage is explained for us by the Chula Vidalla Sutta in the Dhamma discussion between the Arahant Dhammadinna and the lay disciple Visakha. There the Venerable, in answer to a question raised by the lay disciple, comes out with the definition of these three terms. Asasa pasasa ko avusa Visakha kaika eti dhamma kaya patibadha tasma asasa pasasa kaya sankharo. Friend Visakha, in-breath and out-breath are bodily. These things are bound up with the body. That is why in-breath and out-breath are a body preparation. According to this interpretation, in-breathing and out-breathing are a body preparation in the sense that their activity is connected with the body. There is no explicit mention of karma here. Then the definition of Vaci Sankharo is as follows. Pubikoa vosa Visakha vitanketva vicharitva patncha vacham bhindati tasma vitaka vichara vachi sankharo. Friend Visakha, first having thought and pondered, one breaks into speech. That is why thinking and pondering are a speech preparation. Here vachi sankhara is defined as thinking and pondering, not in terms of karma such as abusive speech and the like. Then as the third, Chitta Sankharo is giving the following definition. Sanyacha Vedanacha Chittasika iti Dhamma Chitta Patibadha Tasma Sanyacha Vedanacha Chitta Sankharo. Perception and feeling are mental. They are bound up with the mind. That is why perception and feeling are a mind preparation. Perception and feeling are called a mind preparation because they are mental and have to do with the mind. Comment, here is the translation by Ñāṇananda. Friend Visakha, in-breathing and out-breathing are bodily. These are states bound up with the body. That is why in-breathing and out-breathing are the bodily formation. First one applies thought and sustains thought, and subsequently one breaks out into speech. That is why applied thought and sustained thought are the verbal formation. Perception and feeling are mental. These are states bound up with the mind. That is why perception and feeling are mental formations. As to the parallels, the Madhyama Agama parallel does not have the definition of the three sankharas at all, but we do have it in a Tibetan parallel. Again, this is Shamadeva's compendium of discourse quotations. Based on short quotations in the Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya, Shamatadeva gives us always the whole suttas. It's the main source of Tibetan parallels to the early discourse in Tibetan languages, and it's a specialty of our Bhikkhu Dhammadinna to work on this. So here's my translation. Honorable Visakha, exhalation and inhalation are reckoned as bodily formations. Directed comprehension and sustained discernment are reckoned as verbal formations. Perception and intention are reckoned as mental formations. So we see there's a difference here, that instead of perception and feeling, it speaks of perception and intention. And the verbal formations, Vitaka and Vichara, are rendered in Tibetan by Tokpa and Depa. These are quite similar in their range of meaning, but in Chinese, not in this particular case as we don't have a Chinese parallel, they actually rendered by two characters which really have very little to do with thought. Jie and Guan. Jie is to be aware, to know, and Guan is to contemplate. And I have elsewhere argued that I find it quite significant that the Chinese translators specifically choose characters that do not convey the sense of thought. When Vitaka occurs on its own, they have different characters to render it. And this is important in particular in relation to correct understanding of the significance of absorption attainment in early Buddhist thought. As the Vitaka and Vichara are two factors present in the first absorption, the first jhana, and it has sometimes been taken to imply that absorption is just a state of relaxed, happy reflection. And in my recent book on early Buddhist meditation studies, I have quite a detailed discussion of absorption, and I'm arguing that actually in the suttas, absorption is a rather profound and deeply concentrated state, even the first absorption. And this is why for vitakka and vichara, when they occur in absorption, my personal preferred, somewhat free translation would be initial and sustained mental application. And I think, excuse me, to some extent, we can even see the significance of this in relation to speech, because as we will all be aware, sometimes when we speak, we have some very clear formulated thought in our mind. But at other times, it is possible that someone speaks out and just has a very general direction. And with some people, one even has the impression they, forgive me, but they speak first and think afterwards. And so even as verbal formations, I don't think vitakka and vichara are only thinking and pondering, but they can sometimes just mean that there's a sort of general direction, and as one speaks, the vichara sort of puts in the appropriate concepts and ideas, and these come out immediately when one speaks, but there's not really like a pre-prepared, pre-thought out train of expressions that comes when one speaks. So this is just on vitakka and vichara. End of comment. According to this definition, it appears then what the Buddha had indicated as a second link of the formula of dependent arising is in-breathing and out-breathing, thinking and pondering, and perception and feeling. The mode of interpretation we have adopted shows us that the word sankhara in the context of a drama, for instance, can mean preparations or some sort of preliminary arrangement or fashioning. Comment. Yeah, I understand that when Ñāṇananda is drawing the conclusion here in the first part of his presentation, which is based on the Pali discourses, is entirely straightforward. But as I mentioned earlier, when we look at the parallels, and I think the present instance is a good example to show the power of a comparative study of the early discourses, we find that all of the parallels from different transmission lineages have Manu Sankara instead of Chitta Sankara in the Vibhanga Sutta. This in turn means that the definition of Chitta Sankara, as given for example in Chula Vedala Sutta, is not applicable to the Vibhanga Sutta. And this in turn means that, and this actually also helps to clarify the significance of Sankara as the second link in dependent arising, because in the context of Paticcasamuppada, of dependent arising, Sankaras is by definition conditioned by ignorance. Breathing in and out, this still happens in the case of an Arahant. Thinking and pondering, vitakka, vichara, even just as factors of the absorption, it still happens in the case of an Arahant. Perception and feeling, they still occur in the case of an Arahant. In fact, the Buddha reports about his own practice of mindfulness of breathing, and he says he went on a retreat just to practice mindfulness of breathing. And when he describes the 16 steps, I mean, obviously he is breathing and he experiences the Kaya Sankara and calms it. And he experiences the Chitta Sankara and he calms them. So it is very clear that these three types of Sankaras are still there in the case of a fully awakened one, but a fully awakened one has left behind ignorance. Therefore, it is not possible, it is doctrinally not convincing to apply these three Sankaras to the second link of dependent arising. They should be considered as not an account of the second link in dependent arising. And this is what we can discern only when we look at the parallels. Because when we only have the Pali version, then it's perfectly logical to see that the Vibhanga Sutta speaks of Chitta Sankara, so we must look for a definition of Chitta Sankara elsewhere to understand this passage. But it is when we look at the parallels that it becomes clear that there must have been a mistake in oral transmission, where perhaps because the singular was used, an original correct Mano Sankara became the incorrect Chitta Sankara in the Vibhanga Sutta. And this then obfuscates the significance of this presentation, because it gives the misleading impression that the second link, independent arising, should be understood as referring to in-breathing and out-breathing, to vitakka and vichara, however we want to translate them, and to perception and feeling. This is not the case. The whole point of Paticcasamuppada is to show how ignorance conditions via intervening links dukkha. And with the cessation of ignorance, dukkha ceases. And that cessation of ignorance happens when the arahant is still alive, when he or she still is breathing, still is thinking, and still has perception and feeling. End of comment. Now this sense of preparation is applicable to in-breaths and out-breaths too. As we know, in all our bodily activities, particularly in lifting some weight and the like, or when exerting ourselves, we sometimes take a deep breath, almost impulsively. That is to say, the most basic activity of this body is in-breathing and out-breathing. Moreover, in the definition of Vacisankharam, it is clearly stated that one speaks out having first thought out and pondered. This is a clear instance of the role of sankhara as preparation or a preliminary activity. Now, the word rehearsal is in common use in the society. Sometimes the day before a drama is staged for the society, a sort of trial performance is held. Similarly, before breaking out into speech, one thinks and ponders. That is why sometimes we find words issuing out before we can be aware of it. Thinking and pondering is called Vacisankharam, because they prepare speech. The sense of preparation is therefore quite apt. Then there's perception and feeling, for which the term Chitta Sankhara is used here, instead of Manosankhara. The reason for it is that what we reckon as Manosankhara is actually the more prominent level represented by intentions and the like. The background for those intentions, the subliminal preparatory stage, is to be found in perception and feeling. It is perception and feeling that give the impetus for the rising of the more prominent stage of intention. They provide the necessary mental condition for doing evil or good deeds. This way we can get at the subtle nuances of the term sankhara. Just as in the case of an iceberg floating in the ocean, the greater part is submerged and only a fraction of it shows above the surface. So also the deeper nuances of this term are rather imperceptible. Beneath our heap of body actions, verbal actions, and mental acts of willing or intentions lies a huge mountain of activities. Breathing in and breathing out is the most basic activity in one's life. It is in fact the criterion for judging whether one is alive or dead. For instance, when someone falls in a swoon, we examine him to see whether he is still breathing, whether this basic activity is still there in him. Also in such a case, we try to see whether he can speak and feel, whether perception and feeling are still there in him. So in this way, we can understand how these basic forms of activity decide the criterion for judging whether life is present or extinct in a person. That activity is something internal, but even at that level, defilements lie dormant, because ignorance is hiding here too. In fact, that is precisely why they are reckoned as sankhara. Usually one thinks in terms of I and mine, as I breathe, I speak, I see, and I feel. So, like the submerged portion of an iceberg, these subtle layers of preparations also have ignorance hidden within them. That is why the attempt of pre-Buddhistic ascetics to solve this samsaric riddle by tranquility alone met with failure. Pre-Buddhistic ascetics, and even Nālara Kālāma and Uddaka Buddha, thought that they can get out of this samsara by tranquilizing the bodily activities, the verbal activities, and the mental activities. But they did not understand that all these are sankharas or preparations. Therefore, they were confronted with a certain dilemma. They went on calming down the bodily activities to subtler and subtler levels. They calmed down the in-breaths and out-breaths. They managed to suppress thinking and pondering by concentration exercises, but without proper understanding. It was only a temporary calming down. However, once they reached the level of neither perception nor non-perception, they had to face a certain problem. In fact, the very designation of that level of attainment betrays the dilemma they were in. It means that one is at a loss to say definitely whether there is some perception or not. The Pañchattāya Sutta clearly reveals this fact. It gives expression to the problem facing those ascetics in the following significant statement. Saññā rogo, saññā gando, saññā sallang, asaññā sammoho, etang santang etang panitang yadidang neva saññāna saññam. Perception is a disease, perception is a boil, perception is a duck. But not to have perception is to be deluded. This is peaceful, this is excellent, that is, neither perception nor non-perception. Comment, I just wanted to confirm that a similar statement is found in the Tibetan parallel. End of comment. They understood to some extent that this perception is a disease, a trouble, a tumor, or a wound, or else a thorn. They wanted to be free from perception. But then, on the other hand, they feared that to be totally free from perception is to be in a deluded state. Therefore, they concluded, this is peaceful, this is excellent, that is, neither perception nor non-perception, and came to a halt there. That is why the Buddha rejected even Alara, Kalama, and Uddaka Ramaputta, and went in search of the stilling of all preparations. So, the kind of tranquility meditation followed by the pre-Buddhistic ascetics through various higher knowledges and meditative attainments could never bring about a stilling of all preparations. Why? Because the ignorance underlying those preparations were not discernible to their level of wisdom. In the least, they could not even recognize their sankhara nature. They thought that these are only states of a soul. Therefore, like the present-day Hindu yogins, following the philosophy of the Upanishads, they thought that breathing is just one layer of the self. It is one of the outer rings of the soul. In fact, the kernel of self was supposed to have around it the four rings, Annamaya, Pranamaya, Sanyamaya, and Vijñānamaya. That is to say, made out of food, breath, perception, and consciousness respectively. Apart from treating them as states of a self, they were not able to understand that all these activities are sankharas, and that ignorance is the springboard for them. In view of the fact that Nibbāna is called the stilling of all preparations, Sabba Sankhara Samatha, one might sometimes conclude that the attainment of the cessation of perception and feeling, Saññā Vidāyita Nirodha, is in itself Nibbāna. But it is on rising from that attainment, which is like a deep freeze, that one makes contact with the three deliverances, the signless Animitta, the desireless Appanihita, and the void Sunyata. According to the Buddhist outlook, it is wisdom that decides the issue and not tranquility. Therefore, in the last analysis, preparations cease to be preparations, when the tendency to grasp the sign in the preparations is got rid of and signlessness is experienced. The sign stands for the notion of permanence, and it accounts for the deceptive nature of preparations, as in the case of an actor's makeup and stagecraft. It is the sign of permanence that leads to a desire for something, to expectations and aspirations. So that sign has to leave together with the desire, for the desireless deliverance to come about. Then one has to see all this as essenceless and void. It is just because of desire that we regard something as essential. We ask for the purpose of something when we have desire. Now it is through this unique vision of the signless, the desireless, and the void that the Buddha arrived at the state of stilling of all preparations. We resort to the simile of the film show and the drama, not out of disregard for the precept concerning abstention from such diversions, but because the Buddha has called dancing a form of mad behavior. Ummattakangiyang bhikkave aryasa vinaya yadidang natchang. This, monks, is a form of madness, according to the noble one's discipline, namely dancing. Now what is the nature of a madman? He is jumpy. From the standpoint of Dhamma, dancing is a form of jumpiness. In fact, all preparations are that. It shows a nervous stress, as well as a nervous release. It is an endless series of winding and unwinding. What makes this problem of samsara such a knotty one to solve? We go on heaping up karmic actions, but when the time comes to experience their consequences, we do not regard them as mere results of karma, but superimpose an I on that experience. So we act with the notion of an I, and react to the consequences again with the notion of an I. Because of that egoistic reaction, we heap up fresh karma. So here is a case of stress and release, of winding and rewinding. This is like a tangled skein. Sometimes when an unskilled person tries to disentangle a tangled skein, while disentangling one end, the other end gets entangled. So it is in the case of this samsaric ball of thread. While doing a karma, one is conscious of it as I am doing it. And when it is the turn to suffer for it, one does not think it as a result of that karma. Consequently, one accumulates fresh karma through various attachments and conflicts arising out of it. Here too we see some sort of a drama. Now if one can get the opportunity to see either a rehearsal or the backstage preparations for a drama, which, however, is not usually accessible to the public, one would be able to see through the drama. If one can steal a peep into the backstage make-up contrivances of actors and actresses, one would see how ugly persons can become comely and the wretched can appear regal. One would then see what a poor show it is. In the same way, there is something dramatic in these basic preparations, namely inbreathing and outbreathing, thinking and pondering, perception and feeling. If one sees these backstage preparations with wisdom, one would be disenchanted. What tranquility meditation does is to temporarily calm them down and derive some sort of happiness. That too is necessary from the point of view of concentration, to do away with restlessness and the like, but it does not dispel ignorance. That is why in insight meditation one tries to understand preparations for what they are by dispelling ignorance. The more one sees preparations as preparations, ignorance is dispelled. And the more one dispels ignorance, the preparations lose their significance as preparations. Then one sees the nature of preparations with wisdom as signless, desireless and void. So much so that, in effect, preparations cease to be preparations. This is something of a marvel. If we now hark back to the two words winding and rewinding, the entire world or samsaric existence in its entirety is a process of winding and rewinding. Where the winding ends and the rewinding begins is a matter beyond our comprehension. But one thing is clear, all these comes to cease when craving and grasping are abandoned. It is towards such an objective that our minds turn by recognizing preparations for what they are, as a result of a deeper analysis of their nature. The relation of sankharas to ignorance is somewhat similar to the relation a drama has to its backstage preparations. It seems then that from the standpoint of Dhamma, the entire samsara is a product of specifically prepared intentions, even like the drama with its backstage preparations. Let us return to the simile of the cinema again. The average man, when he says that he has seen a film show, what he has actually seen is just one scene flashing on the screen at a time. As we happened to mention in an earlier sermon, People go to the cinema and to the theater, saying, we are going to see a film show, we are going to see a drama. And they return saying, we have seen a film show, we have seen a drama. But actually, they have neither seen a film nor a drama completely. What really has happened? How did they see a film show? Just as much as one creates a name and form on one's screen of consciousness with the help of preparations, the filmgoer has created a story by putting together the series of scenes falling on the screen. What we mean to say is this. Now supposing the series of consecutive frames, which make up a motion picture, is made to appear on the scene when there is no spectator in the cinema hall. Will there be a film at all? While such an experiment is going on, if a filmgoer steps in late, halfway through, he would not be able to gather that portion of the film already gone. It is gone, gone, gone forever. Those preparations are irrevocably past. A film show actually becomes a film show thanks to that glue used by the audience, the glue of craving. The Buddha has preached that this craving has three characteristics, namely Punobhavika, Nandi Raga Sagata, and Tatra Tatrabhinandan. Tatra Tatrabhinandi. Punobhavika as a characteristic of craving means, in its broader sense, that it leads to re-becoming. One might think that by re-becoming, only the connecting up of one existence in samsara with another is meant, but that is not all. It is craving that connects up one moment of existence with another. One who is seeing a film show, for instance, connects up the first scene with the second in order to understand the latter. And that is how one sees a film show and comes back and says, I have seen a film show. All the scenes do not fall on the screen at once, but a connecting up goes on. That is the idea behind the term Punobhavika. In this connecting up of one scene with another, there is an element of re-becoming, of regeneration. Then there's the term Nandi Raga Sagata. This is the other additive which should be there for one to enjoy the film show. It means the nature of delighting and getting attached. Craving in particular is like a glue. In fact, a synonym for it is lepa, which means glue. Another synonym is visattika, an adhesive, or a sticky substance. Even the word raga, or attachment, already conveys this sense. So craving or desire glues the scenes together. Then comes the term tatra tatabhinandi, the nature of delighting, in particular now here, now there. It is in effect the association of one scene with another in order to make up a story out of it. That is why we made the statement, so far not a single cinema has held a film show and not a single theater has staged a drama. But all the same, those who went to the cinema and the theater witnessed a show and a drama. How? They produced them or prepared them with their sticky defilements on their own. Now in the same way, worldly beings create a film show of name and form on the screen of consciousness with the help of preparations or sankharas. Name and form is a product of imagination, what insight meditators often refer to as reflection on name and form preparations amounts to this. Is there something real in name and form? In our very first sermon, we happen to say something on this point. In the Dvayatānupassana Sutta of the Sutta Nibbāna, the Buddha gives it utterance to the following verse. Anattani attamaning passa lokam sadevakam nivittan nama rupasmin idam satchanti manyati. Just see the world with all its gods, fancying a self where none exists. Entrenched in name and form, it holds the conceit that this is real. Comment, translation by Bhikkhu. Behold the world together with its devas, conceiving a self in what is non-self. Settled upon name and form, they conceive this is true. End of comment. It is as if the Buddha is pinpointing the illusory and deceptive nature of name and form. As we mentioned before, scenes fall on the cinema screen only one at a time. Because of the rapidity of the movie film, it is difficult for one to be aware of this fact. Now, in the case of a drama, the curtain goes down between acts, and the audience waits for the curtain to go up. But they wait ready with their glue to connect the previous act with the one to come, to construct a drama. By the time a certain scene falls on the cinema screen, the previous one is gone for good. Scenes to follow have not yet come. Whatever scene falls on the screen now will not stay there. So what we have here is something illusory, a deceptive phenomenon. Let us now consider an instance like this. Sometimes we see a dog crossing a plank over a stream, stopping halfway through to gaze at the water below. It wags its tail, or growls, or keeps on looking at and away from the water, again and again. Why does it do so? Seeing its own image in the water, it imagines that to be another dog. So it either wags its tail in a friendly way, or growls angrily, else it keeps on stealing glances out of curiosity, love, hate, and delusion. In this case, the dog thinks that it is looking because it sees a dog. But what is really happening? It is just because it is looking that it sees a dog. If the dog had not looked down, it would not have seen a dog looking up at it from below. That is to say, its own image. Now, it is precisely this sort of illusion that is going on with regard to this name and form, the preparations and sense perceptions. Here lies the secret of dependent arising. As a flashback to our film show, it may be added that if the film reel is played at a time when there is no spectator, no film show will be registered anywhere, because there is no mind to put together. It merely flashed on the screen. But if someone had been there to receive it, to contact with his sense bases, that is, to see with his eyes, hear with his ears, and make mental contact with desire, then there comes to be a film show. And so also in the case of a drama. Film producers and dramatists think that the production of the film and the drama is solely their work. But in the last analysis, it is the audience that gives the film and the drama the finishing touch, to make them finished products. Similarly, we tend to think that every object in the world exists in its own right. But then this is what is called Sakkaya Ditthi, the personality view, which carries with it the self-bias. It is such a view that made the dog imagine that there is another dog in the water. It imagined that the dog is there, even when it is not looking. It may have thought, I am looking because a dog appears there, but the fact is that the dog appears there because it cares to look. Here then we have a case of dependent arising, or paticca samuppada. The word paticca has a very deep meaning. The Buddha borrowed many words from the existing philosophical traditions in India. Sometimes he infused new meanings into them and adopted them to his terminology. But the term paticca samuppada is not to be found in any other philosophical system. The special significance of the term lies in the word paticca. On a certain occasion, the Buddha himself gave a definition to this term paticca samuppada. Now it is fairly well known that the Buddha declared that all this suffering is dependently arisen. What then is to be understood by the word dukkha, or suffering? He defines it in terms of the 5 grasping groups, or the 5 aggregates of clinging. As it is said, Sankittena panchupadana khandha dukkha. In short, the 5 grasping groups are suffering. So then, suffering, or the 5 grasping groups, is something dependently arisen. In one discourse in the Nibbāna Samyutta of the Samyutta Nikāya, we find the Buddha making the following significant statement. Paticca samupannam ko upavana dukkhaṃ vuttamaya. King paticca passam paticca. Upavanam, I have declared that suffering is dependently arisen. Dependent on what? Dependent on contact. So from this statement also, it is clear that the 5 groups of grasping arise because of contact, that is, by contacting through the 6 bases. Considered in this way, a thing is called dependently arisen because it arises on being touched by the 6 sense bases. That is why it is called anicca or impermanent. The film show, for instance, was not something already made or ready-made. It arose due to contact. The phrase sankatang paticca samuppannang, prepared and dependently arisen, suggests that the prepared nature is also due to that contact. What may be called abhisankata vijnana, specifically prepared consciousness, is that sort of consciousness which gets attached to name and form. When one sees a film show, one interprets a scene appearing on the screen according to one's likes and dislikes. It becomes a thing of experience for him. Similarly, by imagining a self in name and form, consciousness gets attached to it. It is such a consciousness which is established on name and form that can be called abhisankata vijnana. Then could there be also consciousness which does not reflect the name and form? Yes, there could be. That is what is known as anidassana vijnana, or non-manifestative consciousness. This brings us to an extremely abstruse topic in this Dhamma. There is a very deep verse occurring at the end of the Kevadanta Sutta of the Digha Nikaya, which has been variously interpreted by scholars, both Eastern and Western. It runs, Vijnanang anidassanang anantang sabbatopabhang etta apochapatavi techu vayana gadati etta dighancha rassancha anunthulang subhasubham etta namancha rupancha asesam uparujyati Vijnanasya nirodhena ettethang uparujyati. Comment. I am not presenting translation or the quite significant differences in the parallel versions now, because this verse is basically the topic of the next sermon, so at that time I will be giving more detailed background information. End of comment. The commentary advances several interpretations to this verse. Being unable to give one definite meaning, it suggests several. However, since we have developed a certain mode of interpretation so far, we propose to give preference to it before getting down to the commentary interpretation. Now let us see whether our mode of interpretation can make this verse meaningful. First of all, we have to trace the circumstances which provide the setting for this verse in the Kevadanta Sutta. The Buddha brings out a past episode relating it to the company of monks. A certain monk conceived the riddle, where do these 4 great primaries, earth, water, fire and air, cease altogether? He did not approach the Buddha with this problem, probably because he thought that somewhere in this world system those 4 elements could cease. So what did he do? As he had psychic powers, he went from heaven to heaven and Brahma realm to Brahma realm, asking the gods and Brahmas this question, where do these 4 primaries cease? None among the gods and Brahmas could answer. In the end, Mahabrahma himself asked him why he took the trouble to come all the way there, when he could have easily consulted the Buddha. Then that monk approached the Buddha and put the riddle to him. But before answering the riddle, the Buddha recommended a restatement of it, saying, monks, that is not the way you should put it. You should have worded it differently. Now that means that the question is wrongly put. It is incorrect to ask where the 4 great primaries cease. There is a particular way of wording it, and this is how the Buddha reformulated that riddle. Kata apocha patavi tejo vayana gadati kata dighancha rassancha anunthulang subhasubham kata namancha rupancha asesam uparujyati. Where do earth and water, fire and wind no footing find? Where is it that long and short, fine and coarse, pleasant, unpleasant, as well as name and form, are held in check in a way complete? Here the Buddha introduces a phrase of special significance, na ghadati, does not find a footing. So the question, as we stated, means, where do the four primaries not get a footing? The question then is not about a cessation of the four primaries. It is not a question of their cessation somewhere in the world or in the world system. The correct way to put it is to ask where the four great primaries do not find a footing. The Buddha asks that it may also be asked where long and short, fine and coarse, pleasant and unpleasant, as well as name and form are held in check completely. The word uparujjati means holding in check. Having first reformulated the question, the Buddha gave the answer to it in the verse previously quoted. Let us now try to get at the meaning of this verse. We shall not translate at the very outset the first two lines of the verse. Viññāṇaṁ anidassanam anantang sabbatu pabham. These two lines convey a very deep meaning. Therefore, to start with, we shall take the expression as it is and explain its relation to what follows. It is in this consciousness, which is qualified by the terms anidassanam, anantam, and sabbatupabham, that earth, water, fire, and air do not find a footing. Also, it is in this consciousness that long and short, fine and coarse, and pleasant and unpleasant, as well as name and form, are kept in check. It is by the cessation of consciousness that all these are held in check. Comment: the sermon stops at this point, and the topic of the Anidassana Viññāna is discussed in more detail in Sermon 7. So my suggestion would be that we leave our discussion of this also until we come to the Sermon 7. And the Sermon 6 then, the salient point that I would like to identify is sankharas.